كيف تتعاملون مع الكراهية في أمريكا؟ ارجع لبلدك، لازم نطردكم بالقوة، راح نحاربكم لأن أنتم من قومية أو دين معين، وغيرها من الكلمات اللي يواجهها العديد من سكان أمريكا حتى المولودين فيها. المهاجرين بصورة عامة وجاليتنا من ضمنهم من المستهدفين بهذه الكراهية، اللي ممكن تكون كلمات مباشرة أو تعليقات على الإنترنت أو حتى جرائم ارتكبت ضدهم. بهذا الفيديو راح نشرح لكم حسب القانون الأمريكي كيف تتعاملون مع حوادث الكراهية هذه، وكيف تحمون نفسكم وجاليتكم. راح نشرح التفاصيل التالية: كيف تبلغون قانونيا عن جرائم الكراهية وحوادث الكراهية، معنى جريمة الكراهية، معنى كلام الكراهية أو الكلام العنصري، وكيف تبلغون عنه إذا حسيتوا بخطر، كيف كلام الكراهية أو الكلام العنصري ممكن يكون جريمة ببعض الحالات، كيف ممكن تكونون ضحايا الجرائم الكراهية وأنتم ما لكم علاقة بالموضوع، كيف تبلغون عن التعليقات العنصرية على الإنترنت اللي تحمل تهديدات. وطبعا هذا الكلام يشمل مع الأسف حتى حوادث الكراهية بين أبناء الجالية نفسهم بسبب اختلاف قومياتهم ودياناتهم. بشرح هاي المعلومات القانونية استعانيت بنائبة المدعية العامة لمقاطعة سان دييغو أبيغيل ديلن المختصة بجرائم الكراهية، وكلامها راح يكون عن قوانين ولاية كاليفورنيا، لكن العديد من الشرح يشمل كل ولايات أمريكا. هذا الفيديو برعاية منظمة NSD تطوير وبالتعاون مع مكتب المدعي العام لمقاطعة سان دييغو وإنتاج قناة أمريكا بالعربي. أتمنى تشوفون الفيديو للنهاية، وإذا عندكم أي أسئلة اكتبوها بالتعليقات، راح نحاول نحصل لكم إجابات عليها. وياكم محمد طعمة.
Hi, I'm Abigail Dillon. I'm a Deputy District Attorney with the San Diego DA's office. I work in the Special Operations Division, and I'm specifically assigned to hate crimes. So first and foremost, a hate crime necessarily requires an underlying crime. You know, sometimes when people think of hate crimes, they assume or they think of hate speech. Speech alone typically does not constitute a crime. That's because of the protections of the First Amendment. So in order to have a hate crime, you need to have an actual type of conduct or behavior that constitutes a crime. Then we have to prove that that underlying crime, and it can be any crime, it could be something like theft, it can be something as serious as murder. But then we have to prove that the crime itself was committed because the offender was motivated by bias towards an aspect of the victim's identity. So in other words, that the offender specifically targeted the victim because of some aspect of who they are, whether that's their race, their religion, gender, national origin, sexual orientation. The other thing that most people don't realize about hate crimes is that you can be the victim of a hate crime simply because of your association with the targeted characteristic. So for example, let's say there's an offender out there who has a negative preformed bias, preformed negative opinion about the Muslim community. And let's say the offender is out on the street one day and sees a Muslim person walking with a white person, and the offender ends up attacking the white person because of their association with their Muslim friend. In that case, even though the targeted characteristic is the fact that one of the two people walking is Muslim, the white friend could potentially still be the victim if they were targeted because of their association with that Muslim person. So in other words, you don't have to have the targeted characteristic to be a victim of a hate crime. It could just be based on your association. I think when most people hear the term hate crime, they assume that it must involve deep-seated hate or an act of extremism. I think a lot of times people think of that a hate crime is something that can only be committed by someone who belongs to, for example, a group that supports white supremacy or some organized hateful terror group. But here in California, hate crimes really should be called bias-motivated crimes. We don't have to prove that a crime is motivated by hate necessarily, just that it's motivated by bias. And bias can just mean any preformed negative opinion or attitude about a person because of some aspect of their identity. Each state has its own version of a hate crime statute. Hate crimes can also be prosecuted in some circumstances on a federal level. So here in California, hate crimes are defined by a statute called 422.55A. It's a general statute that provides a definition for how hate crimes are defined here in California. A hate crime in California is a crime committed in whole or in part because of one or more actual or perceived characteristics of the victim. And then in California, there are several protected identity characteristics. Those identity characteristics include disability, gender, nationality, race or ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation, or the association with a person or group with one or more of those actual or perceived characteristics. So I know that that's quite a long definition, so I thought it would be helpful to sort of break it down piece by piece. Like I said, a hate crime can really be any type of crime. So for example, let's say that there is an offender out there who goes and punches another person because of that person's religion, for example. The punch itself is a crime, but the fact that the offender punched the victim because of the victim's religion, that makes the underlying crime a hate crime. And that analysis applies to any type of crime. If we are able to prove that the reason why the crime was committed was because of bias towards the victim's identity, that crime becomes a hate crime. The other thing about hate crimes is that it can be based on the actual or perceived characteristic of the victim. In other words, the offender doesn't have to be right about what they assume the victim is. So for example, I'm a biracial person, my mother is Asian, but sometimes people don't necessarily know my ethnicity just by looking at me walking down the street. So let's say there's an offender out there who has an anti-Hispanic bias, and they wrongfully assume that I'm Hispanic and come and attack me in a crime. That's still a hate crime, even though they're wrong about what they assumed my ethnicity is. So again, it can be based on actual or perceived victim characteristic. I think one of the most confusing parts of hate crimes is, again, that relationship between hate crimes versus hate speech. So here in the United States, we have the protection of the First Amendment, which protects speech and expression. What that means is that sometimes there is speech or expression that is harmful, hateful, or ignorant. And a lot of times people automatically assume that when they hear that type of hate speech, it must mean that a hate crime has been committed. But here in the United States, because of the First Amendment, offensive, harmful speech is still protected speech. So just as an example, if someone shouts at you, "Go back to your own country," when you're just minding your own business, that speech is harmful, it's hurtful, but it's not a crime. Here in California, speech alone is typically not a crime unless it qualifies as something called a criminal threat. A criminal threat means that the speech threatens another person's safety, that threat is immediate and it leaves the victim in fear for their life. That threat has to be specific and it has to be immediate. In other words, if someone is charging at you and says, "I'm going to kill you," and you believe them and you're in fear for your life, that's an example of when speech actually becomes a crime, and that crime is a criminal threat. But otherwise, just offensive speech, hateful speech, that kind of speech alone is not going to qualify as a hate crime. So how do we deal with harmful, hateful speech that doesn't arise to the level of a crime? We refer to that type of speech as a hate incident. So for example, hate incidents can include insults, derogatory comments, people who display hateful material on their property, just as a few examples. Now, here in San Diego, our law enforcement is trained to still take a report when a hate incident is reported to law enforcement. The reason for that is because sometimes hate incidents are precursors to future hate crimes. So in other words, hate incidents can serve as a warning that the person who is using that hateful speech may possibly have a bias against a particular type of person or community. And if they were to, in the future, commit a hate crime against that community, we could look to that documentation of a prior hate incident to prove that this person has a bias towards a particular group. So let me give you an example. Let's say there is an offender out there who is constantly harassing people who speak Arabic, constantly making comments like go back to your own country, speak English, things like that. Let's say that same person then later commits an act of vandalism against an organization that hosts the Arabic community. In order to charge that vandalism as a hate crime, I, as the prosecutor, would have to prove that the offender has a bias or a preformed negative opinion about the Arabic-speaking community. If I had documentation that he had previously been harassing Arabic-speaking people, that could be relevant to our ability to prove the hate crime in the case of that vandalism. So if you are confronted with hate speech in public, that gives you cause for concern, if you report it, law enforcement here in San Diego is trained to document it, and it could potentially be used as evidence in a future hate crimes prosecution. So the main difference between a hate crime and a hate incident is whether or not there is a crime that has taken place or whether it's words alone. If the incident just involves words alone, offensive words such as telling someone to go back to their own country or calling them a derogatory name based on their race or religion, as an example, words alone is going to be characterized as a hate incident, which is protected under the First Amendment. It's offensive and it's harmful, but it's still protected speech. A hate crime, though, does not have the protections of the First Amendment because it involves an actual criminal act. And again, it can be any type of crime. It can be a theft, vandalism, assault, a burglary, something as serious as murder. A hate crime absolutely requires that first there is an actual crime that was committed, and that crime was committed because, in whole or in part, because of bias towards an aspect of the victim's identity. And again, if what is involved in the incident is simply words alone, that will typically be characterized as a hate incident and not a hate crime. The only exception to that rule is if the speech itself arises to the level of a criminal threat. That's one of the few exceptions where words alone can become a crime. But for the most part, things like insults or derogatory comments, those will largely be characterized as hate incidents, not hate crimes, because they're protected speech. We live in a time right now where there is a lot of hate online, and it's really upsetting to see. And, those comments online still qualify as predominantly hate incidents, where unless you're actually threatening someone's life and you appear to have the ability to carry it out. So if someone's communicating threats online, that may qualify as a hate crime. But words alone, hateful comments, derogatory names, using racial slurs, it's upsetting and it's ignorant, but those types of comments that we see online still qualify as protected speech under the First Amendment. Here in San Diego, as well as in the state of California, the most common category of hate crimes that we see are race-based hate crimes, where the victim is targeted because of their race or ethnicity. Amongst the subsections of race-based hate crimes, it's the African American and Black community that are usually the highest targeted victims within race-based hate crimes. The next leading categories are anti-religion crimes or anti-sexual orientation crimes. And within those categories, for religion, we normally see anti-Semitic crimes or crimes committed against Jewish people as the highest form of anti-religion. And as for sexual orientation, it's normally the highest subcategory is victims who are gay men. The most important thing is hate crimes are not just crimes that impact an individual victim, but they actually harm an entire community. And that's why we really prioritize their prosecution. So if you take anything away from this presentation, I hope you understand how important it is to report these types of crimes. When in doubt, always report. You as the victim or the witness, it's not your job to decide whether something is a hate incident or a hate crime. That's something that law enforcement and prosecutors can review for themselves. What's most important is that you report when you feel as though a crime has been committed or hate speech is being directed at you in a way that makes you concerned for yourself or your community. Our law enforcement receives a lot of training here in this county that regardless of whether it's a hate incident or a hate crime, it needs to be documented. The most important thing is if it's an emergency, meaning that the crime is happening now and someone's safety is at risk, the most important way to report is to call 911 immediately. That's the most important takeaway. But there are other avenues for reporting as well. You can call your local law enforcement agency, depending on which part of the county you live in. It could be the sheriff's department or a police department. There's also a link on the district attorney's website where you can submit a report that way. But again, though, at the bottom line is that if it's an emergency, meaning the crime is happening now or someone's life is in danger now, most important is just to call 911. Right? For any questions about hate crimes that you would like to direct to the district attorney's office, you can call 619-515-8805.